In this episode, I want to cover the basic JSON encoding and decoding for my Flutter application. I'm going to start off by taking some Dart objects and encode them into JSON. Once I'm done with that, I'll take the JSON and post it with the HTTP client to my Firebase REST endpoint. Then I'll use the same endpoint to get the JSON with the HTTP client, and then I'll decode the JSON back into my Dart objects. So to get started, I want to go to IntelliJ. So I want to create a new project, and I'm going to set the Flutter SDK, which is already done. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to call this My To-Dos. Then I'll click Finish. Once the project is generated, I'm going to remove the comments just to make it a little bit cleaner for this tutorial episode. So I'm going to minimize the bottom window and the left. What I want to do is hit Command R for replace, and I'm going to look for the comments, and I'm going to use regular expressions, and I'm going to do Command. So what I want to do is remove all these expressions. I'm going to hit Replace All. As you can see, I have regex selected. Then I'm going to right click on Main and reformat code, and I could do that with a Command Alt L as well. So I'm going to remove that new line. Once I have done that, let's see what I want to do next. Let's open up the iOS simulator. Now that the project is ready, I'm going to go ahead and run it to start with. And I'm going to hit the hot reload button, and I'm going to lower the bottom view so I have a little bit more room because I don't need to see everything in that window. Now that the project is up and running, what I want to do is when I click on this button down here, the floating action bar, I want to save some data, and I'll ship that data off to the Firebase using the REST API, and then I'll load the data, and all the while I'll print it down here in the console. So let's start by saying, okay, increment counter, I'm going to save some data. So I'm going to mark to do there, save data, and I'm going to come back to that. So what I want to do first is create a class, and this class is going to be called a to-do class. You always got to use a to-do when you're doing a tutorial. Not really. So let's say Boolean and finished and a string and the name for that class. So I'm going to add a constructor, and for the arguments I'm just going to say finished and this dot name, so that I can instantiate the class quickly with finished and name, and it will set the class variables. Okay, so once I've done that, I'm going to say save data. I'm going to create a method, or in this case, I'm going to create a function. One thing to note is I'm not going to concentrate on structure. I'm just going to show how to wire these pieces up in this tutorial. So structure is not important. It's about wiring the pieces. Okay, so I'm going to create a function called save data, and I'm going to make a new to-do. And in this to-do, I'm going to say false for finish, and I want to create a name. So I'll say to-do, and then I'll use the counter. I'll use string interpolation for the counter and for the counter name. Okay, so then I'm going to click Alt Enter, have it suggest, and I'm going to say create me a function outside the class. I could normally create this in the class, but in this case I'm just going to do it outside the class, and it's called a function. Okay, so I have a to-do. What I need to do is encode this into JSON. So how am I going to encode this into JSON? There's a couple ways to do it, and I'm going to show one of the ways and a couple different dialects of that. So to start with, I need to say here's my JSON equals, and I'll say empty string to start with because I need to create another class, and I'm going to use a JSON codec to do the job. Now if you go to the article or guide for making HTTP networking requests in Flutter, we'll need the library, but we don't have to include it because it's included by default, but we will need this here in a moment. And I just wanted to show the JSON decoding. You can basically call JSON decode and it will map the data. Okay, but that's to encode it, or decode it. I mean JSON encode, and then we get the JSON string. So here we have a map or JSON. So to go back, Hopefully I didn't confuse you there by mixing them up. So what I want to do is I'm going to use a JSON codec, and I'm going to use a constant and say JSON codec, and then I'm going to use the const to instantiate it. So JSON codec, and I'll keep it empty for a moment. So you can see that the type is not on the class path yet, so I've got to import the Dart library, Dart convert library. And once I did that, double clicked and made it all blue. But okay, so that imported, so you can see that it's automatically imported and put up at the top. So once I have that created, I can call JSON codec. I'm going to add a C there, add a C. And then I'm going to say encode, and I'm going to call it, or say encode this object. And there's a couple different ways to encode this object. One is to encodable using a method in the JSON codec, but I'll show the other method here. Let me get the red off that. I'm going to say to JSON. It will call this method and it returns a map. And I'm going to say return a map of the property. So finished. And then I need to say finished, the variable, and then I'll add the name and the value for that name. Okay, so there's a simple JSON map. Now, this is nice to do with complicated object graphs where you're explicit naming. Now, the Dart mirrors is not a part of it. It's blocked in the library for Flutter, and there's some reasons why. I won't cover that in this video, but that would help to actually reflect over the object and actually deserialize and serialize it. But in this case, I think it's much nicer to actually just explicitly write what your intentions are for serializing and deserializing. And this kind of gives you a good path to follow when you're sending and receiving data. Okay, but this, like I said, is one way to do it. There's multiple ways. And you may find another way that may suit your purposes a bit better. But let me cover this. JSON codec. So let's say I encode that. Let's try it out and say JSON equals. And let's do some string interpolation and print it out in the console. So let's run it. Once it runs, I'll hit the plus button. Oh, it's so fast I don't even notice when it reloads. Okay, there we go. At the bottom of the console, we see the mapped properties and values. Okay, so that's the first step. Now I want to send it to my Firebase database REST API so I can persist it on a server. And what's nice is about Firebase is it's quite easy. But to get there, let's instantiate or create an HTTP connection. So I'm going to copy the import in this case because it's not easily auto imported with using this method here. So I'm going to copy the two things and go back to my save data, and I need to create an HTTP request or HTTP client, HTTP TP client, and then I'm going to say post because I want to post the URL. And what's that URL going to be? So string URL. I can say var URL, a little less verbose per se. Okay, so my URL, I need to go to my Firebase. By the way, I'm not setting up authentication at this time. I got read, write, both set to true, so anonymous users can read and write. So I'm going to select data because I'm going to copy my URL and go back, paste in my URL, remove that, and then I'm going to say todo.json. This will be my endpoint to say, here's my list of to-dos on my JSON or for my Firebase database API. Okay, so now I need to say JSON, I want to post you in the body, so I got to say body, and I'm going to give it the JSON. So now I could post to that. Well, it comes back with a response, and how do I get that response? It's a future, but I'm going to say await, and let me work this backwards, and await will give me a response object. And if I wait, I don't have to convert the future. It'll be the response here. This is the object it gives me back. But this means I have to add the async modifier to the method. And it returns a future, of course, but I'm just going to erase that for now. I don't need that type. So it just keeps it a little cleaner for this tutorial. You can choose your best method or best strategy for that on your code. So basically, so I post and I get the response, and let's print the response. Print the response to the console. Response equals, let's say response.body. Whoops, need to autocomplete that. And I use control space to autocomplete. And there we go. So let's see what happens by hit hot reload. And then I'm going to click on the add button. And if I scroll down, I get a response with the key for the database. So if I go to the database, I can see I added a to-do at the endpoint. It pushed a to-do with the mapped of properties, or bag of properties is what I like to think of it as. Finished, false, and to-do is one. So if I go over here to add, and I click on add, it adds another to-do. Pretty slick. This is probably one of the easiest REST APIs I've ever worked with. Okay, so the next step. What do I want to do for the next step? So what I want to do is actually say, after I've saved the data, let me load some data. So the same process. So let's say I can get rid of the to-do because I'm done with that. I'm going to call load data, or create load data. And I'm going to hit Alt Enter for suggestion of methods. I'm going to create a function outside of the class. And I'm going to go ahead and move this closer to the other method here, save data. And what I want to do is repeat the same process, create a client. Now this could probably be a constant maybe. And in another structure, it might be better because it's redundant now, but no matter, it's all about wiring it up. So I'm going to create a response, and I'm going to wait for that response. And so I don't have to configure a future. And say HTTP client. In this case, it's a get to the URL. And I got to add the async modifier. And I'm going to add the async modifier by hitting Alt Enter on it, add async. Now I don't need the future for this at this time, so I'm just going to erase it to keep it simple. So now I have a response. I could print that. Let's print the response. And that equals, and I won't use interpolation this time, I'll just say body. I always have a hard time saying that word, tongue twister for me. So once I print the body, I can say, okay, what I want to do is encode it or decode it back into objects. So I can say var to-dos equals JSON codec, and this time I'm going to call it decode and give it to the JSON. Or not the JSON codec, the JSON from the response. So response dot body. That's going to be the body of the response, which will be a JSON object or a string of JSON. So now I can get the to-do. So well, let's see what that's like. So before I'm going to do that, I'm going to add a print statement, something easy to put a debug breakpoint on. So I'm going to say to-dos.length, and that will be say to-dos.length. Oh, it doesn't have it, so I know it's a map that it returns. So I'm going to go ahead and, oops, didn't like that. So let's say map. Now I gave it the type that it returns. I'll show you why that is. ToString. Okay, so I'm going to pause here, add a breakpoint. And then I'm going to hit hot reload. It's so fast you can't even see it. Oh, 0.7 seconds. Isn't that awesome? So I'm going to hit, okay, so it saved data and then it loaded some data. It went to the HTTP request. So it printed the response. You can see the response. Okay, there's a couple objects in there. And let's see what variables it looks like. So if we inspect the to-dos, let me expand the bottom. So we have a length of 2 for this map, and it's an internal hash map, and it has a linked map, and it's a map of properties, which is another map of properties, and it finally has the false and to-do. So if you can see, what I want to do is convert this hash map into an object that's familiar to, or basically convert it to my class. So how would I do that? How would I convert it to to-do? So the way I'm going to do it in this video is use the codec to encode that or decode that back into my Dart object. So The way I'm going to do it for this video is say, okay, so I have a response of a map, which is a map of a map. You know, it's multiple dimensions, I guess. So what I'm going to do is continue. And then I'm going to go up to the JSON codec, which is up here. And I'm going to use, all right, so I'm going to use a reviver. And I'm going to say reviver, call a method, and I'm going to hit Alt Enter, create function. I love this because you can, once it creates a function, it provides the parameters for the function, the signature, quite easily. And I'm going to hoist it back up to the next of the, I'm going to hoist it back up to the JSON codec area. And what I want to do here is return the value by default. So when it calls this function, it will return the value. This value is most likely a map, internal hash map. So the key is going to be a string. I know it's going to be a string because that's the name of the property. So at least in this instance, maybe your graph, it's going to be different. But so if key is going to be not null, because the last one could be null, and then and key, let's see, no, value is a map. And then I'm going to say, okay, condition by value. Oh, no, key dot contains. And what I want to do is add that hyphen in the for the property. Now, since my Firebase API, it has a random key, arbitrary key for each to-do or class, I've got to add this hyphen here. Now your object graph may be quite a bit different, so you may not need that. You may just say first name, for instance. But in this case, I'm going to say hyphen. It could be completely different. But in this case, I'm going to return a new to-do, and I'm going to say I'm going to use a name constructor from JSON, and I'm going to feed it the map. And now I know it's a map because I said instance of a map here. So if I do that, I'm going to hit Alt Enter for creating the constructor, and then I'm going to add a body to the constructor. Get rid of the semicolon. I'm going to use this type of body for this constructor. So then I'm going to say finished, and I'm going to reference the map and say value is finished. Now this is a little bit verbose, but it's nice to be explicit like this in some cases because it's a consistent pattern. But you can choose your own story and how you build your book there. Okay, so now I have from JSON, it'll instantiate the object and return the object. So if I look back up here, I'm going to instantiate it if it's a map and contains a hyphen and at least the key is not null, so I can verify that. Now there's some slicker techniques with Dart. Now I can't remember at this time when I'm doing this video, so I'm not going to cover that. This is just what I remember from my Java context. Okay, so let's test that. Let's see what it looks like when I run it. Okay, once I hit the add, I come to the objects. Now I'm going to inspect the variables this time and see if it contains the object instantiations that I had. So here's the wrapper of them, or here's the mapped items, and here's each to-do that it returns. And you can see that it's a to-do type, or of the type to-do. And if I expand it, I have the key, and then the value is a to-do object. So that's quite nifty. Now maybe I don't want to instantiate that at this time. I just want to use the mapped items and reference it by saying value, say finished, value, say name. Okay, one more thing to review. In this encoder or the codec, I can use a toEncodable. So what's that mean? toEncodable. So I'm going to call toEncodable and show you what I mean by that. Codable. So I'm going to hit Alt Enter, create a function, and I'm going to copy this and move it up here by the encodec and say toEncodable is the same thing as saying, here we go, to-do object. I know it's going to be a to-do. I know it's going to be to-do in this case, so I'm going to just say, hey, to-do encodable is the same thing as saying map to JSON. So I'm going to copy this map to JSON, and I'm going to comment this out. And the reason why you have to say either to JSON or to encodable, Those are the only two methods when you have a complex class. Okay, so it's the same thing as the JSON. So I'm going to go up here, return the map. But in this case, since it's to do, I got a path to do. So add the to do at the thing. And there we go. Whoops, there's double return. Okay, so now we have to encodable. So now we've moved the to JSON to up here. And instead of that, I'm going to use the to encodable. So I forgot to hit continue. So I hit continue, and let's rerun that by hitting hot reload. And once it reloads, I'm going to hit the add, and it should break. And I'll have the same result in the to-do maps down here. As you can see, to-do, well, I have more of them because more of them are going to the database. So you can see the same exact thing is in the database. By the way, I'm going to hit, oh, it's on, it's braked, so I can't hit that. But each item has the key for the object, which I want to keep the key in the Firebase relationship if I'm using it. And I'm going to hit the value. Now, this isn't the ideal way to use Firebase, but it is a way, and it is nifty that it has an easy REST API to use with the Firebase API. Okay, so let's review. I'm going to hit the continue and review the options here. Now, one of the things to look at is hitting command click on the codec and reviewing the comments of how the codec is used. Now, it covers why the to do encodable here and to do JSON are options. And it covers which default objects it will encode by default and which objects, basically any complex classes, you're going to have to explicitly state, at least with this method. Okay, so here we go to save data. With save data, I create a new to do and I tell it the counter is part of the name. Then I command click on save data. And for save data, I use the JSON codec to encode it. Now, if I go back to the guide, let's go back to the guide. There's an easier way to encode data. Now, that's just to say JSON encode, which is like a static factory. It says, hey, encode this JSON object into a string. But I'm using a codec because I want to use the reviver function and do to encodable function to get the job done. So for save data, it's an async method. And this async method, I wait for the post to respond, and I simply print to console. In the next episode, I'll probably make a list view and actually use this data in the list view. But for now, we're just creating a simple persistence of the object using JSON to the Firebase database. Okay, so once I've done that, I basically say, okay, let's just load the data. I use the same codec and I use that to decode the response. So this response, I'm skipping over the create HTTP request. If I go up to HTTP client, creates a client, and that was imported by saying import the Flutter services.dart. So that creates, or that's the import for this class path, and it can't be auto-generated because at least at this time, by saying once you paste this into the source code. Okay, so then once I load the data, I basically use the reviver function. Double click there in the wrong place. Reviver says if this key is not null and the value is a map and the key contains the hyphen, that means I'm providing the map value, and I can instantiate from a name constructor the to-do object, which has a finished and name property. So then I get this mapped of to-dos, and I can use that in my iterable statements. So basically, that's how I could encode and decode JSON and fetch and persist with Firebase REST API. Thanks for watching today. Follow me for more tips and tricks on Flutter, and I'll catch you later.